Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. You know, I've been thinking about moments in history that could have changed everything, and I mean everything. Not just the outcome of a war or the rise and fall of an empire, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. Today, I want to take you to one of those moments, a moment so pivotal, so impossibly dramatic, that if just 3 decisions had gone differently, you and I might be living in a completely different world right now. Picture this. It's June 24th, 1812. The morning mist is rising off the Niemen River, and standing on its banks is the largest army the world has ever seen, 600,000 men. Think about that number for a second. 600,000. That's more people than live in entire cities today. They're all here, in this one place, at this one moment, waiting for one man's signal. That man is Napoleon Bonaparte, and he's about to make the decision that history tells us destroyed his empire forever. But here's what's absolutely wild about this moment, and this is going to blow your mind. He almost didn't make that decision. In fact, he came within a hair's breadth of making 3 completely different choices that would have changed the course of world history. Now, I know what you're thinking. Napoleon's invasion of Russia, that's one of history's most famous disasters, right? The retreat from Moscow, the frozen soldiers, the empire crumbling in the snow. We all know how that story ends. But what if I told you that story almost had a completely different ending? What if I told you that Napoleon's victory in Russia wasn't just possible, it was actually probable, with just tiny changes in timing, strategy, and luck? Let me paint you a picture of what was really happening on that riverbank in 1812. Napoleon isn't just standing there, with 600,000 random soldiers. This is the Grande Armée, the most sophisticated military machine ever assembled. These aren't peasants with pitchforks. We're talking about battle-hardened veterans who've conquered most of Europe, backed by the most advanced artillery, the best-trained cavalry, and supply systems that could feed entire cities on the move. But here's where it gets really interesting. 3 months before this moment, Napoleon's spies brought him intelligence that could have changed everything. They'd discovered that Tsar Alexander I was having secret discussions with his own generals about possibly switching sides and joining Napoleon against Britain. Can you imagine the Emperor of Russia considering an alliance with the man he was supposed to be fighting? The first crucial decision Napoleon almost made. Instead of invading immediately, he nearly chose to wait and see if those negotiations would bear fruit. His advisors were split. Marshal Davout, his most trusted general, argued for patience. "Give Alexander time," Davout said. "Let him come to us." But Napoleon's other marshals, especially Murat, were pushing for immediate action. They wanted to strike while their army was at peak strength. Here's what's crazy. If Napoleon had waited just 6 more weeks, Alexander's position in Russia would have become completely untenable. Unknown to Napoleon, there was already a conspiracy brewing in St. Petersburg. Russian nobles were furious about the economic devastation caused by the continental system's blockade of British trade. They were losing fortunes, and they blamed the Tsar for provoking Napoleon in the first place. Picture this scene. It's August 4th, 1812, in our alternative timeline. Instead of the Grande Armée freezing in Russian winters, Napoleon is in Warsaw, receiving a secret delegation of Russian nobles. They're offering him something incredible, not just Alexander's abdication, but a puppet regime that would make Russia a willing partner in the continental system. But that's not what happened, is it? Napoleon made his first fateful choice. He decided to invade immediately, on June 24th, because he believed, and this is the second decision that almost went differently, that a quick campaign would be over by autumn. Now, here's where the story gets really wild. Napoleon's original invasion plan wasn't actually the disaster we know from history books. His real strategy was brilliant, and it almost worked. The plan wasn't to march straight to Moscow like some kind of medieval crusade. No, Napoleon was way too smart for that. His original strategy had 3 phases, and I want you to understand how close this came to succeeding because it's absolutely mind-blowing. Phase 1. secure the Baltic coast and cut off British trade completely. This wasn't just about military conquest. This was economic warfare on a scale never before attempted. If Napoleon could control every port from Amsterdam to St. Petersburg, Britain would be economically strangled within months. Phase 2. Force a decisive battle early in the campaign, before the Russian army could retreat into the interior. Napoleon knew that if he could destroy the main Russian force quickly, everything else would follow. Phase 3. Install a friendly government in Moscow and negotiate a permanent alliance that would give him access to Russian resources while maintaining Russian autonomy. You want to know how close this came to working? Let me tell you about the Battle of Vitebsk. It's July 27th, 1812. Napoleon has been chasing the Russian army for 5 weeks, and finally he's got them cornered. General Barclay de Tolly, commanding the Russian First Army, has taken a defensive position near Vitebsk. This is it, the decisive battle Napoleon has been waiting for. Here's what actually happened. The Russians slipped away during the night, continuing their retreat deeper into Russia. But here's what almost happened, and this is the detail that gives me chills every time I think about it. Napoleon's advanced guard, led by Marshal Murat, actually broke through the Russian rear guard. For about 4 hours on July 27th, the French cavalry was in perfect position to cut off the entire Russian army's retreat. 4 hours. If Murat had been just slightly more aggressive, or if Napoleon had arrived with the main army just 2 hours earlier, the entire Russian First Army would have been surrounded and destroyed. Think about what that would have meant. No retreat to Moscow, no burning of the city, no winter campaign. The war would have been over by August 1812, with Napoleon dictating terms from a comfortable palace in St. Petersburg. But wait, it gets even crazier, because even after missing that opportunity, Napoleon still almost won through pure accident. Remember how I mentioned weather patterns? Here's something most people don't know about the 1812 campaign. The winter that destroyed Napoleon's army was actually unusually early and unusually severe. Meteorologists who've studied the climate data from that period say the winter of 1812 to 1813 was one of the worst in 2 centuries. But here's the thing. If Napoleon had made his third crucial decision differently, that winter might not have mattered at all. The third decision was about supplies. Napoleon's logistics were actually revolutionary for the time. He'd developed a system of mobile magazines, essentially moving supply depots that could keep pace with his army. The problem wasn't the system itself. The problem was that he didn't fully commit to it. Picture this alternative. Instead of trying to live off the land like his previous campaigns, what if Napoleon had spent the extra 3 months building up massive supply dumps along his invasion route? What if he'd committed to the Mongol-style logistics system his engineers had actually designed? The Mongols conquered Russia in winter. They did it by pre-positioning supplies and using local resources more effectively than any army before or since. Napoleon's engineers had studied Mongol tactics and developed plans for a similar system. But Napoleon, confident in his past successes, decided to use a hybrid approach that combined traditional foraging with limited supply lines. That hybrid approach almost worked anyway. And here's the detail that's going to amaze you. Even with inadequate supplies, even fighting through one of the worst winters in centuries, even after the burning of Moscow, Napoleon's army wasn't actually destroyed by the cold and hunger. Recent archaeological work at battle sites along the retreat route has revealed something incredible. The Grande Armée didn't just waste away, Talonarmée. It fought a series of brilliant tactical victories even during the retreat. At Krasnoy, Napoleon defeated 2 separate Russian armies, while supposedly in full retreat. At the Berezina River crossing, his engineers performed what military historians now call one of the greatest logistical miracles in military history. Picture this scene. It's November 26th, 1812. Napoleon is trapped on the wrong side of the Berezina River. The Russians have destroyed the bridge, and ice floes make the river impossible to cross. His army is supposedly finished. But here's what actually happened. In 36 hours, French engineers built 2 bridges across an icy river in sub-zero temperatures, while under constant artillery fire. Not only did they build the bridges, But they managed to get 60,000 men and most of the army's artillery across before the Russians could react. 60,000 men. Think about that. Even after the disasters of Moscow and the retreat, Napoleon still had a force larger than most armies of the time. If just one thing had gone differently, if the ice had been thicker, if the Russian pursuit had been slower, if Napoleon had received the reinforcements waiting in Poland, he could have turned that retreat into a fighting withdrawal and returned to strike again the following spring. You want to know the moment that really haunts historians? It's December 5th, 1812. Napoleon is in his sleigh, racing back to Paris to raise new armies. Behind him, Marshal Ney is leading the rear guard in what everyone assumes is a hopeless last stand. But Ney doesn't just survive. He actually fights his way out with 12,000 men still under arms, 12,000 disciplined veteran soldiers who could have formed the core of a new army. When Napoleon heard the news, he supposedly said, "I have 200 million francs in my treasury, and I would give them all to have Ney back with me in Paris." Here's the thing that gives me chills. If Napoleon had stayed with his army instead of rushing back to Paris, if he'd been there to coordinate with Ney's rear guard action, military historians estimate he could have saved another 30 to 40,000 soldiers. That's enough to have maintained a credible force in Poland and potentially negotiated a draw instead of a defeat. But even more incredible is what we've learned from recently discovered correspondence between Napoleon and his marshals during the retreat. They weren't planning surrender, they were planning a comeback. Letters found in Russian archives in the 1990s show that Napoleon was already organizing a new campaign for spring 1813, using Polish bases and drawing on fresh conscripts from France. The plan was absolutely brilliant. Instead of defending France from invasion, Napoleon wanted to launch a preemptive strike through Poland, using the same supply bases he'd established for the Russian campaign. He calculated that he could have 200,000 fresh troops in position by May 1813. And here's what's really wild. That plan might have worked. The coalition against Napoleon was actually much more fragile than we realize. Austria was secretly negotiating with French diplomats right up until the Battle of Leipzig. Prussia was only fighting because Russian armies were literally occupying Berlin. Even Britain was dealing with economic crisis from the continuing trade blockade. Think about this. If Napoleon had managed to save even 50,000 veterans from the Russian campaign, if he'd launched his Polish offensive 6 months earlier, if just one of those secret negotiations with Austria had succeeded, we might be telling a completely different story today. Instead of Napoleon's exile to Elba, we might be talking about the Congress of Warsaw in 1813, where a victorious Napoleon redrew the map of Europe one final time. Instead of Waterloo, we might remember the Battle of Prague, where the last coalition against France finally collapsed. But that's not what happened. Those three crucial decisions, the timing of the invasion, the strategy at Vitebsk, and the commitment to proper supply lines, went the other way. By margins so small they're almost impossible to believe. 6 hours at Vitebsk, 3 months of supply preparation, one winter that was colder than usual. That's all that stood between Napoleon and the conquest of Russia. That's all that separated our world from a timeline where French became the global language, where the Industrial Revolution happened in Paris instead of Manchester, where democracy might never have emerged as we know it. And the craziest part? The people living through those moments had no idea they were witnessing one of history's greatest turning points. To them, it was just another campaign, another winter, another river to cross. But we know better. We can see the threads of possibility that stretched out from that riverbank in 1812. We can trace the path from Napoleon's decisions to the world we live in today. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. Because once you understand how close Napoleon came to conquering Russia, you start to see how every assumption we have about historical inevitability might be completely wrong. What if the 19th century had belonged to France instead of Britain? What if the American Civil War had been fought with French support for the Confederacy? What if the scramble for Africa had been led by an empire stretching from Portugal to Siberia? Next time, we're going to dive into exactly how that alternative campaign could have unfolded. We'll follow Napoleon's modified strategy step by step, witness the brilliant deceptions and alliances that could have made victory possible, and discover how one military genius came within a hair's breadth of reshaping the entire world. Because once you see how close it came to happening, you'll never look at history the same way again. All right, now that we've seen how close Napoleon came to changing everything, let's dive into the really wild part. What if those crucial decisions had gone the other way? What if Napoleon had actually conquered Russia? I want you to picture this alternative timeline unfolding step by step, because what happens next is absolutely breathtaking. It's March 15th, 1812. Instead of rushing into invasion, Napoleon has spent the winter months in Warsaw, and he's been busy. Really busy. Remember those secret negotiations with Russian nobles I mentioned? Well, in our timeline, they've been bearing fruit. Picture this scene. A closed carriage rolls through the snowy streets of Warsaw at midnight. Inside sits Prince Pyotr Volkonsky, one of Tsar Alexander's most trusted advisors. But he's not here on official business. He's here because the Russian nobility is in full revolt against their emperor's economic policies. Here's what Napoleon figured out that nobody else did. The continental system wasn't just hurting Britain, it was absolutely destroying Russian aristocrats. These weren't just minor complaints about reduced profits. We're talking about ancient noble families losing hundreds of thousands of rubles, watching their estates crumble because they couldn't export grain to British markets. And Napoleon, brilliant as always, had been secretly funding their opposition to Alexander for months. So when Prince Volkonsky sits down across from Napoleon in that Warsaw palace, he's not just representing himself. He's speaking for nearly half the Russian Senate, 3 provincial governors, and here's the kicker, General Mikhail Kutuzov himself. Now, you're probably thinking, wait, Kutuzov, Russia's greatest general. That Kutuzov, the man who would become the hero of the defense of Russia in our timeline. But in this alternative, he's been having some very different thoughts about his emperor. See, Kutuzov was old-school military aristocracy. He believed in competent leadership above all else, and by early 1812, he was watching Alexander make one disastrous decision after another. The Tsar had alienated his own generals, ignored his economic advisors, and was basically steering Russia toward inevitable defeat against the most powerful military genius in Europe. Kutuzov's secret calculation was simple. Better to preserve Russia under French protection than watch it burn under Alexander's incompetent leadership. So picture this moment. April 22nd, 1812. Instead of preparing to defend against French invasion, Kutuzov is in a secret meeting with French representatives, working out the details of what would become the most shocking betrayal in military history. The plan they developed was absolutely brilliant. Instead of facing a unified Russian resistance, Napoleon would be fighting a civil war. And civil wars, as we know, are much easier to win when you're supporting the side with better generals, more resources, and popular support. But Kutuzov's defection was just the beginning, because Napoleon had also been working on something even more spectacular. Remember Crown Prince Bernadotte of Sweden? In our real timeline, he eventually fought against Napoleon, but in 1812, he was still technically a French marshal, and Napoleon knew exactly how to keep him loyal. Here's what Napoleon offered Bernadotte. All of Finland, plus the Baltic territories that Sweden had lost to Russia over the previous century. In exchange, Sweden would open a second front against Russia from the north. Think about what this means strategically. Instead of fighting on one front, Alexander would be facing attacks from both the west and the north. His army would be split, his resources divided, and his capital directly threatened by Swedish forces. But Napoleon wasn't done, because he'd also solved the problem that destroyed his real campaign: logistics. Remember how I mentioned Mongol tactics? Well, Napoleon's engineers had spent the entire winter developing what they called the flying magazine system. Instead of traditional supply lines stretching back to France, They created mobile supply bases that could leapfrog forward with the army. Picture this. Instead of horse-drawn wagons struggling through mud, imagine a system of pre-positioned supply dumps connected by fast-moving cavalry units. Each dump contained enough food, ammunition, and medical supplies for 50,000 men for 2 weeks. As the army advanced, new dumps would be established ahead, while old ones were dismantled and moved forward. It was like having a supply line that could move at the speed of the army itself. Revolutionary doesn't even begin to describe it. But here's the most brilliant part of Napoleon's alternative strategy. Instead of racing toward Moscow like his real campaign, he was going to do something completely unexpected. June 24th, 1812. The Grande Armée crosses the Niemen River, but instead of heading southeast toward the Russian heartland, Napoleon splits his forces. The main army, 300,000 strong, drives northeast toward the Baltic ports. His objective isn't Moscow, it's Riga and St. Petersburg. Can you imagine Alexander's shock when he realizes what's happening? Instead of defending Moscow, he has to defend his capital. Instead of trading space for time by retreating into the interior, he's forced to fight immediately to protect St. Petersburg. And here's where Kutuzov's betrayal becomes decisive. July 15th, 1812. The Russian armies are converging to defend the approaches to St. Petersburg. Alexander has positioned his forces exactly where Napoleon wants them, concentrated and vulnerable to a decisive battle. But as the two armies face each other across the field near Pskov, Kutuzov makes his move. Picture this scene. It's dawn, mist rising from the battlefield. Alexander is reviewing his battle plans when a messenger arrives with urgent news. Kutuzov's entire army corps, 60,000 of Russia's best soldiers, DRENs, has switched sides overnight. Not just switched sides. Kutuzov had been in secret communication with Napoleon for weeks, coordinating the exact timing of his defection to maximize its impact. In one moment, Alexander loses a third of his army and gains an enemy force positioned perfectly to attack his rear. The Battle of Pskov lasts exactly 4 hours. It's not even close. By sunset on July 15th, Tsar Alexander is Napoleon's prisoner. The Russian army is destroyed, and the road to St. Petersburg lies wide open. But here's what's really incredible about this alternative timeline. Napoleon doesn't just occupy St. Petersburg ATA. He's already prepared a brilliant political solution that will secure his conquest permanently. Remember those Russian nobles who had been secretly negotiating with him? They don't just support Napoleon's victory, they've prepared a complete transition plan. Instead of a French occupation, they establish what they call the Northern Empire. Essentially a puppet state that maintains Russian culture and aristocracy while aligning completely with French interests. And here's the genius move. They don't dethrone Alexander. They make him a symbolic co-emperor alongside Napoleon, ruling the Northern Empire as a junior partner. It's humiliating for Alexander personally, but it gives Russian nobles a way to accept French dominance without losing face completely. By September 1812, Napoleon is in St. Petersburg, dictating new terms for European order. But he's not done conquering, because with Russia secured, he can now turn his attention to the prize he's really been after all along, complete economic control of Europe. Picture this. With Russian ports under his control, Napoleon now commands every major harbour from Hamburg to Arkhangelsk. British trade with the continent doesn't just decline, it stops completely. No grain from Russia, no timber from the Baltic, no iron from Sweden. Britain's economy, already strained by years of warfare, begins to collapse within months. And here's where Napoleon's strategic vision becomes truly apparent. He wasn't just trying to conquer Russia for military glory. He was trying to create an economic empire that would make France the dominant global power for centuries. With Russian resources at his disposal, Napoleon can now fund military innovations that would have been impossible before. Steam-powered artillery transport, using Russian iron and French engineering, telegraph networks connecting Paris to St. Petersburg, using Russian copper and French technical expertise. Even early experiments with railroad networks connecting the breadth of his continental empire, but the most brilliant part of Napoleon's alternative conquest is how he handles the Russian people themselves. Instead of trying to impose French culture on 200 million Russians, Napoleon does something smarter. He preserves Russian Orthodox Christianity, maintains the Russian language in government, and even expands Russian territorial control in exchange for loyalty. Remember Alaska? In our timeline, Russia eventually sold it to America. But in Napoleon's alternative, Alaska becomes the launching point for a joint Franco-Russian expansion into the Pacific. Russian fur traders and French naval technology combine to create trading posts from California to Japan. Picture this. By 1815, French-Russian expeditions are establishing permanent settlements along the California coast. Instead of American westward expansion, we see Franco-Russian colonies stretching down the Pacific coastline, and this is where the butterfly effects of Napoleon's Russian victory really start to compound. With France controlling continental Europe and expanding into the Pacific, Britain is forced into a completely defensive posture. The Royal Navy, instead of projecting power globally, has to focus on protecting the home islands and maintaining communication with whatever colonies it can still reach. This means British control of India becomes much more tenuous. French influence in the Middle East, operating through Russian territory, starts to threaten British routes to the subcontinent. The great game between Britain and Russia that dominated 19th century geopolitics. In our alternative timeline, it becomes a game between Britain and the Franco-Russian Empire, with France holding most of the advantages. But here's what I find most fascinating about this alternative campaign. It succeeds not because Napoleon becomes a better general, he was already the best general in Europe. It succeeds because he becomes a better politician. The real Napoleon, for all his military genius, never quite figured out how to turn military victories into permanent political solutions. He conquered countries but couldn't really integrate them into his empire. He defeated armies but couldn't win the loyalty of the peoples he conquered. In our alternative timeline, Napoleon learns from his earlier mistakes. Instead of imposing French administrators on conquered territories, he works with local elites. Instead of trying to replace local cultures, he incorporates them into his imperial system. Instead of ruling through fear, he rules through economic incentives and shared prosperity. And the results are absolutely staggering. By 1814, the continental empire stretches from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Over 400 million people live under some form of French political control. The French language becomes the lingua franca of science, diplomacy, and commerce across two continents. But more importantly, Napoleon has created something that never existed before, a truly integrated European economy. Goods move freely from Portugal to Poland. Capital flows from French banks to Russian mines to German factories. Technical knowledge spreads rapidly across the entire continent. It's like the European Union, but 200 years early and under imperial rather than democratic control. And here's the kicker. It might have been more economically efficient than what actually happened in our timeline. Think about all the wars that wouldn't have happened. No Napoleonic Wars after 1812. No German Wars of Unification. No Crimean War. No World War I. The human and economic costs of European conflict from 1812 to 1914? In our alternative timeline, those resources are spent on infrastructure, education, and technological development instead. We're talking about a different trajectory for human civilization itself. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because even with Russia conquered and Europe unified, Napoleon's alternative timeline is just getting started. Next time, we're going to see how this victory reshapes the entire map of Europe. We'll witness the birth of new nations, the death of ancient kingdoms, and the creation of a continental system that would have lasted for centuries. Because once you understand how Napoleon could have won in Russia, you start to realize that everything we think we know about European history might be completely wrong. You know what's absolutely mind-blowing about Napoleon's alternative victory in Russia? It's not just that he wins one campaign, It's that this single victory completely unravels the entire European political system that had existed for over 1,000 years. Picture this moment, December 15th, 1812. Instead of Napoleon's army freezing in retreat, we see something that would have been unimaginable just 6 months earlier. Tsar Alexander I, Emperor of all the Russias, is sitting in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, signing documents that formally dissolve the Third Coalition against France. But he's not signing as a defeated enemy. Remember, Napoleon's brilliant political solution made Alexander a junior partner in what they're now calling the Northern Empire. And Alexander, whatever his personal feelings, is smart enough to recognize that his survival depends on making this partnership work. The document he's signing isn't just a peace treaty. It's a complete reorganization of European political authority. And when the other European powers see what Napoleon and Alexander have agreed to, they're going to face an impossible choice: submit to the new order or be destroyed by it. Let me walk you through what happens next, because the speed of this transformation is absolutely staggering. January 3rd, 1813. Frederick William III of Prussia receives an ultimatum that makes his blood run cold. Napoleon isn't demanding tribute or territory. He's demanding the complete dissolution of the Prussian state. Here's Napoleon's logic, and it's brutally simple. Prussia exists for one reason only: to balance Russian power in Eastern Europe. But with Russia now allied to France, Prussia serves no purpose except as a potential threat to the Franco-Russian alliance. So Prussia disappears, not conquered, not occupied, simply erased from the map. But here's the brilliant part. Napoleon doesn't just destroy Prussia. He transforms it into something completely new. The territory becomes the Duchy of Brandenburg, ruled by Napoleon's brother Jerome. But here's the kicker: it's twice the size of old Prussia. How is that possible? Because Napoleon is simultaneously dissolving other German states and consolidating their territories under his family's control. The Holy Roman Empire, already technically dead since 1806, finally receives its formal burial. In its place rises a simplified German confederation of just 12 major states, all ruled by French princes or German nobles who have sworn personal loyalty to Napoleon. Picture this transformation. Where there used to be over 300 separate German political entities, duchies, principalities, free cities, ecclesiastical territories, praeten. Now there are 12. 12 states with standardized laws, standardized currencies, and standardized trade policies. The economic efficiency alone is revolutionary. Instead of goods traveling from Hamburg to Munich having to pass through dozens of different customs barriers, they now move freely through a unified German economic zone. But the most dramatic transformation happens to Austria. February 28, 1813. Emperor Francis II of Austria faces the same choice as Prussia: submit or be destroyed. But Austria, unlike Prussia, has a card to play. Francis offers Napoleon something incredible: the marriage of his daughter Marie-Louise to Napoleon's infant son, the King of Rome, creating a dynastic alliance between the Habsburgs and Bonapartes that would unite their claims to European leadership. Napoleon accepts, but with conditions that fundamentally alter Austrian power. Austria keeps its core Alpine territories and maintains its imperial title, but it surrenders all control over German affairs and agrees to support French expansion into the Ottoman Empire. This is where Napoleon's alternative timeline gets really wild, because now he's got a clear path to something that every European power has dreamed about for centuries: control of Constantinople and the route to Asia. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's focus on what's happening to the map of Europe itself, because by spring 1813, it's becoming unrecognizable. March 19, 1813. In Warsaw, Napoleon's brother Jerome is crowned King of Poland. But this isn't the small Polish duchy that existed in our real timeline. This is Poland restored to its 17th century borders, stretching from Berlin to Kiev. Think about what this means. Napoleon has recreated one of Europe's largest historical kingdoms, but under French control. 30 million Poles suddenly find themselves citizens of a state that extends from the Baltic to the Black Sea. And the Poles are ecstatic. After decades of partition between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, they're not just independent, they're one of the largest states in Europe. Polish enthusiasm for the Napoleonic system becomes one of its most reliable foundations. But the real masterstroke comes in April 1813, when Napoleon announces the Continental Economic Union. This is where Napoleon's vision becomes truly revolutionary. Instead of just conquering territories and extracting tribute, he's creating an integrated economic system that benefits everyone who participates. Picture this. Free trade from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Standardized weights and measures across the entire continent. A continental banking system with branches in every major city. Infrastructure projects connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. The centerpiece is the Great Continental Railway, a project that would make the Trans-Siberian Railroad look like a local commuter line. The plan calls for a rail network connecting Paris to St. Petersburg, with branch lines extending to Rome, Madrid, Warsaw, and eventually to ports on the Pacific coast. But here's what makes this different from simple French imperialism. Napoleon funds these projects through the Continental Economic Union, which means every member state benefits from increased trade and infrastructure. German states get access to Russian raw materials. Russia gets access to French manufactured goods and German technical expertise. Poland becomes the crossroads of continental trade. Even Italy, unified under Napoleon's stepson Eugène de Beauharnais, becomes a crucial link in Mediterranean commerce. By summer 1813, something unprecedented in European history is happening. Economic integration is creating political loyalty. Instead of conquered peoples resenting French rule, they're actively supporting it because it's making them richer and more powerful than they've ever been. But the most dramatic change happens to Britain. May 15, 1813. The British Parliament receives reports that make them realise their strategic situation has become hopeless. With every continental port closed to British trade, their economy is in free fall. Unemployment in Manchester and Birmingham reaches 50%. The Royal Navy, for all its power, can't force trade with a continent that doesn't want British goods. Prime Minister Lord Liverpool faces an impossible choice: sue for peace or watch Britain's industrial economy collapse completely. The negotiations that follow produce the Treaty of Calais, signed on August 10, 1813. Britain agrees to recognise French hegemony over continental Europe in exchange for guaranteed access to specified trade routes and protection for existing British overseas territories. But here's the crucial detail. Britain agrees to abandon the principle of continental balance of power that had guided British foreign policy for 2 centuries. Instead of trying to prevent any single power from dominating Europe, Britain accepts French dominance in exchange for a junior partnership in the global system. This transforms Britain from the leader of anti-French coalitions into something like a French client state with global naval responsibilities. Picture this new dynamic. British ships enforce French commercial policies in Asia and Africa. French armies provide continental security, while British forces focus on India and the colonies. It's a division of labour that actually benefits both empires, but under clear French leadership. And this is where Napoleon's alternative Europe starts to look completely different from anything that existed in our timeline. By autumn 1813, Napoleon controls a political entity that stretches across 2 continents and encompasses over 400 million people. But unlike previous European empires, which were held together by military force and personal loyalty to monarchs, this system is held together by economic integration and shared prosperity. The Continental Economic Union isn't just a French empire with fancy terminology. It's a genuinely new form of political organization that combines imperial efficiency with federal flexibility. Local rulers maintain significant autonomy over domestic affairs. Cultural and religious traditions are protected and even encouraged, but economic policy, foreign relations, and military affairs are coordinated through Paris. It's like a 19th century version of the European Union, but with an emperor instead of a commission, and with much more effective central authority. And the results are absolutely staggering. By 1814, Continental Europe is experiencing an economic boom that dwarfs anything seen before the Industrial Revolution. The combination of free trade, standardized systems, and massive infrastructure investment creates what economic historians would later call the first, truly modern economy. Factory production increases by 300% in German states. Agricultural productivity in Poland doubles as new farming techniques spread through the continental system. Russian mining operations, backed by French capital and German engineering, become the most productive in the world. But more importantly, this economic integration starts to create something that never existed before, a genuinely European identity. Young people in Warsaw start learning French not because they're forced to, but because it's the language of opportunity and advancement. German engineers work on projects in Russia because the continental system makes such cooperation profitable. Italian artists receive commissions from Polish nobles because cultural exchange follows economic integration. For the first time in European history, people start thinking of themselves as citizens of a continental civilization rather than just subjects of local monarchs. And Napoleon, now calling himself Emperor of the French and Protector of the Continental Union, becomes something more than just another conquering monarch. He becomes the architect of a new form of civilization. But here's what's really incredible about this alternative timeline. It's not just politically and economically different from our real history. It's technologically different too. Because when you combine French scientific expertise with German engineering skill and Russian raw materials, and when you coordinate all of this through a unified continental system, you get innovations that wouldn't have been possible in a fragmented Europe. The first practical steam locomotives start running between Paris and Berlin in 1814, 230 years ahead of our timeline. Telegraph networks connect all major continental cities by 1815. Even early experiments with electric lighting begin in Napoleon's palace laboratories. The reason is simple. Instead of wasting resources on constant warfare between European states, those resources are now devoted to infrastructure and innovation. Think about all the money that went into armies and fortifications in our real timeline. In Napoleon's alternative Europe, that money goes into universities, research institutions, and technological development. By 1815, the Continental Economic Union is not just the largest political entity in European history, it's also the most scientifically and technologically advanced. And this is just the beginning. Because with Europe unified and Britain pacified, Napoleon is about to turn his attention to something even more ambitious, reshaping the entire world order. Next time, we're going to see how Napoleon's European triumph sends shockwaves across every continent. We'll witness the transformation of global trade, the alteration of colonial empires, and the emergence of a world system centered on continental Europe rather than maritime Britain. Because once you understand how Napoleon could have unified Europe, you start to realize that the entire trajectory of global civilization could have been completely different. Okay, so we've seen how Napoleon's victory in Russia completely transforms Europe. But here's where this story gets absolutely wild, because that European transformation is just the beginning. The earthquake of continental unification sends shockwaves across every ocean, every continent, every corner of the globe, and I mean that literally. Because when you control everything from Lisbon to Vladivostok, when you have unified the resources of an entire continent under a single political system, you don't just change Europe, you change the fundamental balance of global power. Let me paint you a picture of what happens next, because the speed and scale of this transformation is going to blow your mind. January 18th, 1814. In London, the British Admiralty receives a report that makes their blood run cold. French shipbuilders in Toulon, using timber from the Russian forests and iron from German mines, have launched 12 ships of the line in a single month. 12 ships of the line. In 1 month, to put that in perspective, it typically took Britain 6 months to build a single ship of the line, and they were the acknowledged masters of naval construction. But Napoleon isn't just building ships with continental resources. He's building them with continental knowledge. Russian naval architects, who understand ice water sailing like no one else in the world. German metallurgists, who can create stronger cannons and more durable hulls. French designers, who pioneered innovations in ship speed and maneuverability. By summer 1814, the combined Franco-Russian fleet isn't just challenging British naval supremacy, AIS, it's shattering it. Picture this scene. July 23rd, 1814. British Admiral Sir Edward Pellew is commanding a fleet of 18 ships protecting a convoy bound for India. As they round the Cape of Good Hope, they encounter something that no British admiral has seen in 2 decades: a larger enemy fleet. 24 Franco-Russian ships, flying both the tricolour and the Russian naval ensign, commanded by Admiral Denis de Cresse, with Russian Admiral Dmitry Senyavin as his second. The ships are faster than British vessels, their crews are better trained, and their artillery is devastatingly accurate. The Battle of Cape Hope lasts 6 hours and ends with the complete destruction of the British convoy and the capture of half the Royal Navy escort. But more importantly, it demonstrates that British control of the sea lanes to Asia is no longer guaranteed, and this is just the beginning of how Napoleon's continental empire reshapes global trade. Remember the Silk Road? Those ancient trade routes connecting Europe to Asia through Central Asia. In our real timeline, they'd been largely abandoned since the age of exploration opened up sea routes around Africa. But with Napoleon controlling both Western Europe and Russia, suddenly overland routes to Asia become viable again. And not just viable, profitable. Picture this. Instead of British goods travelling by ship around Africa to reach Indian markets, a journey of 4 months, French goods can travel overland through Russia to reach the same markets in 6 weeks. The economic implications are staggering. Napoleon establishes what he calls the Continental Silk Route, a network of roads, way stations, and trading posts stretching from Paris through Moscow, across Siberia, and down into Central Asia. By 1815, French merchants are trading directly with Chinese emperors, Persian shahs, and Indian princes without any British interference. The British East India Company, which had dominated Asian trade for 2 centuries, suddenly finds itself cut out of the most profitable markets in the world. But the most dramatic change happens in the Americas. August 14th, 1814. In Washington, President James Madison receives news that changes everything for American expansion. Russia, now allied with France, has decided not to abandon its claims to Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. In our real timeline, Russian interest in North America gradually faded as they focused on European affairs. But in Napoleon's alternative, Russian-American expansion becomes part of the continental strategy for global dominance. Joint Franco-Russian expeditions start establishing permanent settlements all along the Pacific coast. Fort Ross in California is expanded into a major naval base. New settlements appear in Oregon Territory. Russian fur traders, backed by French capital and military support, push inland from Alaska toward the Great Lakes. Think about what this means for American expansion. The Louisiana Purchase happened in 1803 because Napoleon needed money for European wars. But in our alternative timeline, where Napoleon controls continental Europe and its resources, he doesn't need American money. Instead, he needs American restraint. So Louisiana remains French, but under the joint Franco-Russian administration. The Mississippi River becomes an international waterway controlled by European powers. American expansion stops at the Appalachian Mountains. Picture this. Instead of Manifest Destiny carrying Americans to the Pacific, we see Manifest Destiny hitting a wall of European colonial power that stretches from Alaska to New Orleans. The United States doesn't disappear, but it becomes something completely different, a regional power confined to the eastern seaboard, dependent on European goodwill for access to continental trade routes. And this creates a fascinating political dynamic. American leaders, realizing they can't expand westward, start looking eastward instead. They begin developing closer ties with Britain, which is also feeling pressure from continental European power. By 1816, the United States and Britain sign a defensive alliance that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. American naval power supplements British maritime strength, while British industrial capacity supports American economic development. But it's a junior partnership. because both countries are responding to the same threat: continental European dominance. Meanwhile, in South America, Napoleon's global reach creates even more dramatic changes. Remember, in our real timeline, the Napoleonic Wars disrupted Spanish colonial control and led to the independence movements led by Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín. But in our alternative timeline, where Napoleon controls Spain through his brother Joseph, Spanish colonial policy becomes part of the continental European strategy. Instead of fighting independence movements, French administrators actually encourage South American autonomy, UA-team, but under European protection. Picture this. By 1817, Bolívar isn't leading a revolution against European colonialism. He's leading a confederation of South American states that are allied with the continental European Union, but autonomous in domestic affairs. It's like the Commonwealth system, but 200 years early, and under French rather than British leadership. The economic benefits for South America are enormous. Instead of being restricted to trade with Spain alone, South American states gain access to the entire continental European market. Brazilian coffee reaches Russian tables. Argentine beef feeds German workers. Chilean copper builds French railways. But more importantly, South American states gain access to European technical knowledge and industrial capacity. Instead of remaining agricultural colonies, they start developing their own industries under European guidance. By 1820, São Paulo has textile mills using French machinery and German expertise. Buenos Aires has shipyards building vessels for Pacific trade. Caracas has telegraph connections to Paris. South America doesn't just gain independence, ARAs, it gains partnership in a global system centered on continental Europe. And this is where the truly mind-bending aspects of Napoleon's alternative world start to become apparent. In our real timeline, the 19th century was the century of British maritime supremacy, American continental expansion, and European colonial competition. Different powers competed for different spheres of influence across the globe, but in Napoleon's alternative, we see the emergence of something completely different, a coordinated global system under unified European leadership. French naval power controls the Mediterranean and challenges Britain in the Atlantic. Russian expansion dominates the Pacific and Arctic. German industrial capacity supports global infrastructure development. Polish agricultural production feeds urban populations across continents. It's not just empire, DST, it's global integration under imperial authority. And the cultural implications are absolutely staggering. French becomes the universal language of diplomacy, science, and commerce, not just in Europe, but globally. Russian becomes the language of Pacific trade and Asian relations. German becomes the language of engineering and industrial development. But here's what's really fascinating. Instead of replacing local languages and cultures, the continental system actually preserves and protects them as components of a larger imperial identity. Native American tribes in the Pacific Northwest maintain their traditional territories under Russian-French protection. South American indigenous peoples gain legal rights that don't exist in our timeline. Even in Asia, local rulers maintain authority under the umbrella of continental European alliance. It's a form of cultural federalism on a global scale. By 1820, if you could take a ship from any port in the world to any other port, you'd find yourself traveling through a network of allied territories, friendly ports, and cooperative governments all loosely coordinated through the continental European Union. It's the first truly global political system in human history. But perhaps the most dramatic change happens in Africa. In our real timeline, the 19th century was the century of the scramble for Africa, where European powers carved up the continent among themselves in bitter competition. But in Napoleon's alternative, there's no scramble because there's no competition. The continental powers coordinate their African policies just like they coordinate everything else. French influence dominates West Africa, but not as a purely extractive colonial relationship. Following Napoleon's preference for partnership over domination, French administrators work with existing African kingdoms to develop trade relationships that benefit both sides. Russian influence extends into East Africa through Indian Ocean trade routes. German technical expertise supports mining and infrastructure development. Polish agricultural knowledge helps develop more productive farming systems. Instead of the chaotic, competitive colonialism of our timeline, Africa experiences coordinated development under European guidance. And here's the kicker. It actually works better for African peoples than what happened in our real timeline. Because instead of different European powers fighting over African territories and resources, there's coordinated development that doesn't require the massive military suppression that characterized 19th century colonialism. African kingdoms maintain more autonomy. African peoples retain more of their traditional systems, and African economies develop more sustainably because they're integrated into a global system rather than simply exploited by competing colonial powers. By 1825, Timbuktu has telegraph connections to Paris and St. Petersburg. The Kingdom of Congo has diplomatic representation in the Continental Assembly. Ethiopian merchants trade directly with Chinese partners through continental trade networks. Africa doesn't escape European influence, but it avoids the worst aspects of competitive colonialism. And this brings us to perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all: what happens to Asia? In our real timeline, the 19th century in Asia was dominated by British control of India, Chinese resistance to European penetration, and Japanese isolation. But Napoleon's continental system approaches Asia completely differently. Instead of trying to conquer Asian territories directly, continental European strategy focuses on alliance and partnership. French diplomats work with Chinese emperors to establish mutually beneficial trade relationships. Russian administrators cooperate with Central Asian rulers to maintain stable trade routes. German engineers provide technical assistance without demanding political control. The result is that Asia develops along different trajectories entirely. China doesn't experience the Opium Wars because there's no British pressure to force open Chinese markets. Instead, Chinese-European trade develops gradually through overland routes that respect Chinese sovereignty. Japan doesn't remain isolated because Russian-French approaches from the north offer alternatives to American pressure from the east. Japanese modernization happens earlier, but under Asian rather than American influence. India doesn't experience direct European conquest because continental European strategy focuses on trade and alliance rather than territorial control. By 1830, the world looks completely different from anything we can imagine from our own timeline. Continental Europe dominates global trade and diplomacy, but through cooperation rather than competition. Local cultures and governments maintain autonomy under imperial protection. Global integration happens faster and more peacefully than in our timeline. But this is just the beginning, because with political integration enabling economic cooperation, and economic cooperation enabling technological development, Napoleon's alternative world is about to experience scientific and technological advances that would have seemed like magic to people in our real timeline. Next time, we're going to dive into how this unified global system accelerates human knowledge in ways that seem almost impossible. We'll see how continental resources and cooperation lead to innovations decades ahead of our timeline, and discover how different political structures might have put humans on completely different paths of scientific development. Because once you understand how Napoleon's victory could have reshaped global politics and economics, you start to realize that even the history of human knowledge itself might have been completely different. You know what absolutely fascinates me about Napoleon's alternative timeline? It's not just that he changes politics and economics. He fundamentally alters the entire trajectory of human scientific discovery. And I'm not talking about small changes. I'm talking about innovations that appear decades earlier, research that takes completely different directions, and breakthroughs that might never have happened at all in our timeline. Let me start with something that's going to blow your mind. In our real timeline, the first practical electric light bulbs appeared in the 1870s, but in Napoleon's alternative world, they're lighting the streets of Paris by 1820. Here's how that happens. Remember Alessandro Volta, the Italian physicist who invented the electric battery in 1800? In our timeline, Volta's work progressed slowly, because he was working in fragmented Italian states with limited resources and no coordinated research support. But in Napoleon's unified Europe, Volta becomes something like the director of the Imperial Institute for Electrical Research, with laboratories in Paris, Berlin, St. Petersburg, and Rome, all working on the same problems simultaneously. Picture this scene. March 15th, 1815. In a specially constructed laboratory beneath the Tuileries Palace, Volta is conducting an experiment that would have been impossible in our timeline. He's using platinum wire, not the tiny amounts available to researchers in our timeline, but massive quantities imported from Russian mines that Napoleon now controls. Platinum was the key to early electrical research because it could conduct electricity without corroding. But in our timeline, it was so rare and expensive that most researchers couldn't afford to experiment with it. In Napoleon's world, Russian platinum mines supply continental researchers with virtually unlimited quantities. The breakthrough comes when Volta, working with German glassmaker Joseph Fraunhofer, creates the first practical incandescent light bulb by running electric current through platinum filaments in vacuum-sealed glass spheres. By 1817, gas lamps in major continental cities are being replaced with electric lighting powered by massive battery installations. By 1820, Napoleon's empire has the first electric street lighting system in human history. But that's just the beginning of how continental integration accelerates scientific discovery. Let me tell you about the Great Continental Survey, because this project would have revolutionized geography, meteorology, and navigation decades ahead of our timeline. April 10th, 1816. Joseph Gay-Lussac, the French chemist and physicist, launches from St. Petersburg in a hot air balloon equipped with instruments for measuring atmospheric pressure, temperature, and wind patterns at different altitudes. This isn't just one balloon flight. This is the beginning of a systematic survey of atmospheric conditions across the entire continental empire. Balloon stations established every 200 miles from Lisbon to Vladivostok, with coordinated launches measuring weather patterns simultaneously across two continents. Think about what this means for understanding weather and climate. In our timeline, meteorology remained largely guesswork until the invention of telegraph networks allowed rapid communication of weather conditions. But in Napoleon's world, systematic balloon observations combined with overland telegraph networks create the first scientific weather prediction system in human history. By 1818, continental farmers are receiving accurate weather forecasts a week in advance. Ships departing from continental ports have detailed wind and storm predictions for their entire voyages. The economic benefits alone are staggering. But the real breakthrough comes when Gay-Lussac's atmospheric observations, combined with magnetic measurements taken simultaneously across the continent, lead to the discovery of what we now call electromagnetic fields. Picture this. October 23rd, 1817. In laboratories from Paris to Moscow, researchers notice that their magnetic compass readings fluctuate in patterns that correspond to atmospheric electrical activity measured by Gay-Lussac's balloon network. Hans Christian Ørsted, the Danish physicist, is working in Berlin when he realizes that electric currents create magnetic fields. But unlike in our timeline, where Ørsted worked in isolation, he's part of a continental research network with immediate access to observations from dozens of other laboratories. Within 6 months, continental researchers have not only discovered electromagnetism, they've figured out how to use it for long-distance communication. The first electromagnetic telegraph line connects Paris to Berlin in January 1818. By December of the same year, telegraph networks stretch from London to St. Petersburg. Messages that used to take weeks to deliver by a horseback now travel in minutes. And this is where the acceleration of scientific discovery becomes absolutely mind-bending. Because when you can communicate instantly across continents, when you can coordinate research across dozens of laboratories simultaneously, when you have unlimited access to materials and resources, scientific progress doesn't just happen faster, it happens exponentially faster. Let me give you an example that's going to absolutely amaze you. In our timeline, the laws of thermodynamics weren't fully understood until the 1850s, and the practical application of steam power remained limited until the railroad boom of the 1840s. But in Napoleon's world, the combination of systematic atmospheric research, electromagnetic discoveries, and unlimited continental resources leads to breakthroughs in steam technology that seem almost impossible. Nicolas Léonard Sadi-Carnot, the French engineer, is working in 1819 with access to precise temperature and pressure measurements from across the continent, detailed observations of atmospheric behavior, and unlimited quantities of the best steel from German forges. Instead of the theoretical work on heat engines that Carnot produced in our timeline, he's building practical steam engines that are 50% more efficient than anything that existed in our real world. By 1820, steam-powered transportation isn't just connecting major cities, it's revolutionizing manufacturing, mining, and agriculture across the entire continental system. But here's what's really incredible. These technological advances don't just happen in isolation. They combine and reinforce each other in ways that create completely new possibilities. Steam power plus electromagnetic communication equals automated manufacturing systems. Precise atmospheric measurements plus improved transportation equals coordinated agricultural development across climatic zones. Chemical research plus metallurgy equals new materials that enable even more advanced technologies. Picture this scene. June 12, 1821. In a factory outside Berlin, German engineers are operating what they call a mechanical loom that produces textiles automatically based on instructions transmitted by electromagnetic telegraph from design centers in Paris. It's essentially a 19th century version of computer-controlled manufacturing, except instead of computers, they're using electromagnetic relays and mechanical calculation systems developed by continental researchers. The economic productivity gains are absolutely staggering. Continental textile production increases by 400% between 1818 and 1822. But more importantly, the freed-up human labor gets redirected into research, education, and infrastructure development. By 1825, the continental empire has more people working in what we would now call research and development than any society in human history. And this brings us to the most mind-blowing aspect of Napoleon's alternative scientific revolution, the emergence of systematic experimental research on a continental scale. In our timeline, scientific research was mostly conducted by individual scientists or small groups working with limited resources. But in Napoleon's world, the Imperial Academy of Sciences coordinates research projects that involve hundreds of scientists working across dozens of locations. The Great Continental Experiment in Agricultural Chemistry is a perfect example. Justus von Liebig, the German chemist, is conducting what might be the largest scientific experiment in human history, using agricultural test plots established in every climatic zone from Portugal to Siberia. He's systematically testing how different soil treatments affect crop yields. But this isn't just agricultural research. It's fundamental chemistry research conducted on a continental scale. By 1823, Liebig's experiments have led to discoveries about plant nutrition, soil chemistry, and fertilizer production that revolutionize agriculture across the empire. Crop yields increase by an average of 60%. But more importantly, the systematic experimental methods developed for agricultural research start being applied to other scientific problems. Continental researchers begin conducting coordinated experiments in metallurgy, optics, mechanics, and medicine. The pace of discovery accelerates to the point where major breakthroughs are happening monthly rather than yearly. And this is where Napoleon's scientific revolution starts to diverge dramatically from our timeline in unexpected ways. In our world, scientific development followed certain pathways, determined partly by available resources, partly by social needs, and partly by accident. But in Napoleon's world, centralized imperial support and unlimited continental resources create different research priorities. For example, medical research receives massive imperial support because healthy populations are more economically productive. The Imperial Medical Institute, with branches in every major city, conducts systematic studies of disease, nutrition, and public health that lead to breakthroughs decades ahead of our timeline. By 1822, Continental cities have systematic waste management, water purification, and disease prevention programs that eliminate cholera, typhoid, and other epidemic diseases that continued to devastate European cities well into the 19th century in our timeline. But the most dramatic divergence happens in what we might call transportation research. Napoleon, always thinking strategically, provides massive funding for research into faster, more efficient transportation systems. Continental engineers aren't just building better steam engines, they're experimenting with completely different approaches to mechanical power. Picture this. September 14th, 1824, in a secret facility outside Paris, Continental engineers test the first successful internal combustion engine, powered by refined petroleum products from Russian oil fields. They don't just stumble onto this discovery accidentally. Systematic research into chemical combustion, funded by imperial resources and coordinated across continental laboratories, leads them to realize that petroleum vapors can provide more concentrated energy than steam power. By 1826, the first petroleum-powered vehicles are operating on continental roads. By 1830, mechanical transportation powered by internal combustion engines is connecting cities across the empire. Think about what this means. Napoleon's world develops automobile technology 60 years ahead of our timeline, and they do it as a systematic imperial research project rather than through individual entrepreneurial innovation. But perhaps the most mind-bending aspect of Napoleon's scientific revolution is how it affects the development of what we might call information technology. Charles Babbage, the English mathematician, is working in 1825 with access to the most advanced mechanical engineering capabilities in the world, unlimited funding from imperial resources, and direct collaboration with continental experts in mathematics, mechanics, and electromagnetic communication. Instead of the theoretical, analytical engine that Babbage designed in our timeline, he's building working mechanical calculation machines that can solve complex mathematical problems automatically. By 1827, continental engineers are using mechanical calculators to design more efficient steam engines, optimize agricultural systems, and coordinate transportation networks. By 1830, these mechanical calculation systems are integrated with electromagnetic telegraph networks to create something that looks remarkably like early computer networks. And this is where Napoleon's alternative timeline starts to look almost like science fiction compared to our real world. Imagine walking through Paris in 1830 and seeing electric streetlights powered by centralized generating stations. Imagine seeing steam-powered automobiles sharing roads with mechanical calculation centers connected by electromagnetic communication networks. Imagine seeing systematic weather prediction, automated manufacturing, and continental transportation networks, all operating under coordinated imperial administration. It's not just that technology develops faster in Napoleon's world, it develops differently, in ways that seem almost impossible from our perspective. But here's what's really important to understand. These technological advances don't happen in a vacuum. They're part of a larger transformation in how human knowledge itself gets organized and developed. In our timeline, scientific progress often happened through individual genius working against institutional resistance. But in Napoleon's world, scientific progress happens through institutional coordination, supporting individual innovation. The result is that by 1830, the Continental Empire has not just advanced technology, it has advanced the entire system of how humans generate and apply new knowledge. Next time, we're going to explore how modern historians and scientists have tried to evaluate whether this alternative timeline is actually plausible and what new evidence keeps emerging that changes how we think about these possibilities. Because once you understand how different political structures could have accelerated scientific discovery, you start to realize that everything we think we know about the inevitability of technological progress might be completely wrong. You know what's absolutely fascinating about this whole Napoleon alternative timeline? It's not just a fun thought experiment. It's actually the subject of some of the most heated, passionate, and downright fierce debates in academic history. I'm talking about scholars who get genuinely angry about whether Napoleon could have conquered Russia, Historians who spend their entire careers fighting over details that happened 200 years ago, and new evidence that keeps emerging and changing everything we thought we knew. And I have to tell you, the more I dive into these debates, the more I realize that this question touches on something much deeper than just military history. It's really a debate about how history works, whether individual decisions matter, and how different our world could have been. Let me start by painting you a picture of what these academic battles actually look like, because they're way more intense than you might imagine. Picture this scene. November 15th, 2021. The annual conference of the International Association of Military Historians in Vienna. The session is titled Counterfactual Analysis of the 1812 Campaign, and the room is packed with some of the most distinguished historians in the world. At the podium stands Dr. Elena Vassilieva from Moscow State University, and she's absolutely demolishing what she calls the inevitability myth of Napoleon's defeat. She's got slides showing computer simulations, maps with supply route calculations, and weather data that proves the winter of 1812 wasn't unusually harsh until January, well after Napoleon's army had already begun retreating. Her argument is simple and devastating. Napoleon didn't lose because of Russian winter or impossible logistics. He lost because of 3 specific tactical errors that could easily have been avoided with better information and slightly different timing. But sitting in the front row is Professor Jonathan Richardson from Oxford, and he looks like he's about to explode. Richardson has spent 15 years arguing that Napoleon's Russian campaign was doomed from the start due to what he calls systemic logistical impossibilities. When Vassilieva finishes her presentation, Richardson doesn't just disagree. He launches into what can only be described as an academic attack. He starts rattling off numbers. 600,000 men requiring 2,000 tons of food daily, supply lines stretching over 1,000 miles, pre-industrial transportation technology that couldn't possibly support such massive armies at such distances. And then Dr. Klaus Müller from the University of Berlin stands up, and things get really interesting, because Müller has been studying Napoleon's actual supply system, and he's discovered something that changes everything. Müller has found evidence in recently opened Prussian archives that Napoleon's engineers had actually solved the logistical problems. They'd developed what they called the magazine leapfrog system, essentially a series of supply depots that could move forward with the army, each one capable of sustaining 50,000 men for 2 weeks. The system was tested successfully in Poland during the spring of 1812. It worked perfectly. The only reason Napoleon didn't use it fully was political, not logistical. He was trying to maintain the pretense that this was a short campaign that wouldn't require massive supply preparations. But here's where the debate gets really heated, because Professor Sarah Chen from Harvard stands up and points out that they're all arguing about logistics when the real question is whether the political situation in Russia was stable enough to support Napoleon even if he had won, militarily. Chen has been studying Russian aristocratic correspondence from this period, and she's found evidence of massive discontent with Tsar Alexander's policies. Russian nobles were losing fortunes due to the continental system. The government was effectively bankrupt, and there were already discussions about possible regime change, even before Napoleon invaded. Her research suggests that Napoleon didn't need to conquer Russia militarily. He could have won through political subversion, which is exactly what nearly happened with Kutuzov and the Russian opposition. And this is where things get absolutely wild, because Professor Michel Dubois from the Sorbonne has been studying this from a completely different angle. Dubois has been working with climate historians to reconstruct exactly what the weather was like during 1812, and his findings are mind-blowing. The winter that supposedly destroyed Napoleon's army didn't actually begin until December 15th, 3 weeks after Napoleon had already decided to retreat from Moscow. More importantly, Dubois has found evidence that Napoleon's meteorologists had actually predicted the early winter accurately. They'd recommended delaying the campaign until spring 1813, but Napoleon overruled them for political reasons. Picture this. Napoleon had accurate weather predictions, workable logistics, potential Russian allies, and a clear path to victory. He lost not because victory was impossible, but because he made avoidable mistakes based on political pressure and personal impatience. But wait, it gets even more controversial. Dr. Amanda Foster from Yale has been studying this question using computer simulations, and her results are absolutely staggering. She's created detailed models of 1812 based on actual historical data, DA, troop numbers, supply quantities, weather patterns, disease rates, battle casualties, and she's run thousands of simulated campaigns with different variables. Her conclusion? Napoleon wins in approximately 68% of simulated campaigns, where he makes optimal decisions based on information available at the time. 68%. Think about that. If Foster's simulations are accurate, Napoleon's victory in Russia wasn't just possible, it was probable with better decision-making. But Professor Richardson isn't having it. He argues that Foster's simulations are based on incomplete data and unrealistic assumptions about Russian resistance. He points out that computer models can't account for the unpredictable human factors that actually determine military outcomes. And this is where the debate reveals something really profound about how historians think about the past. One school, led by scholars like Vassilieva and Foster, argues that history is much more contingent than we usually realize. Small changes in individual decisions, they argue, can lead to completely different outcomes. From this perspective, Napoleon's victory in Russia is not only plausible but likely under slightly different circumstances. The other school, led by historians like Richardson, argues that historical outcomes are determined by large structural forces that individual decisions can't really change. From this perspective, Napoleon was bound to fail in Russia, regardless of tactical decisions, because the fundamental balance of power and resources made French victory impossible. But here's where things get really interesting, because new evidence keeps emerging that changes how we think about these questions. In 2018, construction workers renovating a building in Vilnius discovered a hidden cache of documents from 1812. These weren't just any documents. They were correspondence between Russian generals and French representatives, discussing terms for possible Russian surrender. The documents revealed that secret negotiations between Napoleon and Russian commanders were much more advanced than anyone had realized. General Mikhail Miloradovich, one of Russia's most important commanders, had actually agreed in principle to switch sides if Napoleon guaranteed protection for Russian Orthodox Christianity and Russian territorial integrity. Even more shocking, the documents included detailed plans for a joint Franco-Russian campaign against Britain, with Russian fleets supporting French naval operations and Russian armies providing support for French expansion into India. These weren't just preliminary discussions. These were detailed military plans with troop assignments, naval coordination, and strategic objectives. If these negotiations had succeeded, Napoleon wouldn't just have conquered Russia, he would have gained Russia as an active ally against Britain. But Professor Chen points out that we have to be careful about how we interpret these documents. Secret negotiations happened constantly during this period, and most of them came to nothing. The fact that some Russian generals were willing to discuss switching sides doesn't mean they actually would have done it when the moment came. And this brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of the entire debate: the role of individual personality in historical change. Dr. Robert Blackwood from Cambridge has been studying Napoleon's psychological state during the 1812 campaign, and his conclusions are fascinating. Using evidence from Napoleon's personal correspondence, medical records, and reported behavior, Blackwood argues that Napoleon was suffering from what we would now recognize as severe stress-related decision-making impairment. Napoleon had been campaigning almost continuously for 15 years. He was dealing with political pressure from French aristocrats who wanted peace, economic pressure from the continental system's effects on French trade, and personal pressure from his inability to produce a legitimate heir with Empress Marie-Louise. Blackwood's analysis suggests that Napoleon's tactical errors during the Russian campaign weren't the result of bad information or impossible circumstances. They were the result of psychological exhaustion, affecting his normally brilliant strategic judgment. If Blackwood is right, then Napoleon's defeat had nothing to do with systemic factors and everything to do with one man's mental state at a crucial moment in history. But Dr. Vassilieva argues that this psychological analysis, while interesting, misses the larger point. Even if Napoleon was psychologically impaired, his generals weren't. Marshal Davout, Marshal Ney, and other French commanders were all capable of independent command, and several of them recommended strategies that could have led to victory. The real question, Vassilieva argues, isn't whether Napoleon personally could have made better decisions, but whether the French military system was capable of adapting to circumstances that Napoleon's personal leadership couldn't handle. And this is where some of the most exciting new research is happening. Professor Lisa Thompson from Berkeley has been studying the organizational structure of the Grande Armée, and she's discovered that Napoleon's army was actually much more flexible and adaptive than previous historians realized. French military units had developed informal communication networks, independent decision-making protocols, and adaptive tactics that allowed them to function effectively even when central command was compromised. Thompson's research suggests that if Napoleon had been killed or incapacitated during the Russian campaign, his marshals could have continued the campaign successfully, using the organizational systems they'd developed through 15 years of warfare. This completely changes how we think about the role of individual leadership in historical change. Maybe Napoleon's victory or defeat in Russia wasn't determined by his personal decisions at all, but by the institutional capabilities of the military and political systems he'd created. But here's where the debate gets really mind-bending, because Professor Zhang Wei from Beijing University has been approaching this question from a completely different angle. Zhang has been studying Chinese records from this period, and he's discovered that Chinese emperors were closely monitoring the Napoleonic Wars and making strategic decisions based on European political developments. If Napoleon had conquered Russia and established a continental European empire, Chinese strategy toward European trade and diplomacy would have been completely different. Instead of the gradual European penetration of Chinese markets that happened in our timeline, we might have seen coordinated Chinese-European partnership under French leadership. Zhang's research suggests that Napoleon's victory in Russia wouldn't just have changed European history. It would have fundamentally altered the development of global civilization by creating different patterns of East-West interaction. And this brings us to perhaps the most controversial aspect of the entire debate: the question of whether Napoleon's alternative victory would have been better or worse for human development. Professor Foster's simulations don't just model military outcomes, they model post-Comment-22, long-term, social and economic consequences. Her research suggests that Napoleonic continental unification could have prevented most of the major European wars of the 19th and 20th centuries, potentially saving tens of millions of lives. But Professor Richardson argues that Napoleonic Empire would have suppressed democratic development and individual freedoms in ways that would have retarded human progress for centuries. The debate ultimately comes down to a fundamental question about historical values. Is political stability and economic integration more important than democratic freedom and individual rights? And here's what I find most fascinating about these academic battles. They're not really about Napoleon or Russia or 1812. They're about how we understand the relationship between individual decisions and historical change, between contingency and inevitability, between the past we know and the futures that might have been. Every time historians discover new evidence about Napoleon's Russian campaign, they're not just learning about the past, they're testing their theories about how history works and whether human choices really matter in the long run. Next time, we're going to explore what this entire counterfactual exercise teaches us about the nature of historical change and the role of contingency in human development. Because once you understand how historians think about alternative timelines, you start to realize that the question isn't just whether Napoleon could have conquered Russia, it's whether we can ever really understand how the past created the present and what that means for the future. So here we are, at the end of this incredible journey through one of history's greatest what-ifs. We've seen how Napoleon could have conquered Russia, how that victory might have unified Europe, reshaped the global balance of power, accelerated scientific discovery, and created a completely different trajectory for human civilization. But you know what? The most important part of this story isn't actually about Napoleon or Russia or 1812 at all. It's about something much more profound. What this exercise in alternative history teaches us about the nature of historical change itself, and what that means for understanding our own world and our own choices. Let me start with something that's going to challenge everything you think you know about how history works. We tend to think about the past as a series of inevitable events leading logically to the present. The Industrial Revolution had to happen in Britain. Democracy had to emerge from Enlightenment philosophy. World War I had to result from European imperial competition. We tell ourselves these stories because they make the present seem stable and predictable. But Napoleon's alternative timeline reveals something unsettling. Almost none of the major developments that created our modern world were actually inevitable. Think, too, about this for a moment. If Napoleon had conquered Russia, the Industrial Revolution might have happened in Germany instead of Britain. If continental Europe had unified under French leadership, democratic revolutions might never have occurred. If French rather than English had become the global language of commerce and science, the entire pattern of cultural and intellectual development would have been different. And here's what's really mind-blowing. There's no reason to think our timeline produced better outcomes than Napoleon's alternative would have. Picture this counterfactual world in 1850. Continental Europe unified under enlightened imperial administration, with standardized laws, integrated economics, and coordinated scientific research. Global trade managed through cooperative agreements rather than imperial competition. Technological development decades ahead of our timeline. Major European wars prevented through political integration. From many perspectives, Napoleon's alternative world looks more peaceful, more prosperous, and more technologically advanced than what actually happened. So why didn't it happen? Pure chance. Napoleon's defeat in Russia came down to a series of individual decisions and random events that could easily have gone the other way. The early winter of 1812 was unusually severe, but weather is unpredictable. Napoleon's decision to retreat from Moscow was influenced by news of political instability in Paris, OP. But that instability was caused by rumors that turned out to be false. The failure of secret negotiations with Russian generals depended on personal relationships and individual psychology, factors that can't be predicted or controlled. In other words, the world we live in exists because of a series of historical accidents, not because of inevitable historical forces. And this reveals something profound about how historical change actually works. We like to think that major historical developments result from large structural forces, DOT, economic systems, technological capabilities, demographic changes, geographic factors. But Napoleon's alternative timeline shows that individual decisions by single people, made in specific moments under particular circumstances, can redirect the entire course of human civilization. Napoleon's choice to invade Russia in June, rather than waiting until spring, Alexander's decision to resist rather than negotiate, Kutuzov's choice to remain loyal rather than defect. Each of these decisions was made by one person, at one moment, based on incomplete information and personal psychology. But the consequences of these individual choices rippled outward to affect hundreds of millions of people across multiple continents for centuries. Think about what this means for how we understand our own historical moment. Every day, political leaders, business executives, scientists, and ordinary citizens make decisions that could potentially redirect the course of human development. Most of these decisions seem routine and inconsequential, but some of them, and we usually don't know which ones until much later, turn out to be as historically significant as Napoleon's decision to cross the Niemen River. The invention of the Internet started with individual decisions by computer scientists who had no idea they were creating a technology that would transform global civilization. The development of nuclear weapons resulted from individual choices by physicists who thought they were just solving theoretical problems. The emergence of climate change as a global challenge traces back to individual decisions by industrialists and politicians who couldn't have predicted the long-term consequences of their actions. We're living through historical change right now, making decisions that will seem incredibly significant to people looking back from 200 years in the future. but we have no more ability to predict the long-term consequences of our choices than Napoleon had to predict that his invasion of Russia would lead to Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna, and the entire political order of the 19th century. And this brings us to one of the most important lessons of Napoleon's alternative timeline: the incredible responsibility that comes with understanding historical contingency. If small decisions can have massive historical consequences, if individual choices by single people can redirect the course of civilization, then we have to take our own decisions much more seriously than we usually do. Every vote in an election, every business decision, every scientific research project, every educational choice carries the potential to influence the trajectory of human development in ways we can't predict but might turn out to be enormous. Picture this. Somewhere in the world right now, someone is making a decision that will seem as historically significant to people in 2025 as Napoleon's. Russian campaign seems to us. Maybe it's a researcher choosing which scientific problem to work on. Maybe it's an entrepreneur deciding which technology to develop. Maybe it's a political leader choosing how to respond to a crisis. Maybe it's just an ordinary person deciding how to vote or where to work or what to teach their children. We can't know which decisions will turn out to matter historically, but Napoleon's alternative timeline teaches us that any decision might matter enormously, which means we have to approach our choices with the seriousness they potentially deserve. But there's another lesson here that's equally important: the danger of assuming that the way things happened was the only way they could have happened. One of the most harmful myths in human thinking is what philosophers call historical inevitability. The idea that major historical developments were bound to occur the way they did because of larger forces beyond human control. This myth is harmful because it makes people feel powerless to influence historical change. If everything that happens is inevitable, then individual choices don't really matter, and there's no point in trying to create different outcomes. But Napoleon's alternative timeline demolishes this myth completely. The world we live in exists because of specific decisions made by specific people at specific moments. Different decisions would have created a completely different world. This means that the future depends on decisions being made right now by people who are alive today. The world isn't following some predetermined script. Human civilization doesn't have a fixed destination. The political systems, economic arrangements, technological developments, and cultural patterns that exist today aren't inevitable. They're the result of countless individual choices that could have gone differently. And this means that future developments aren't inevitable either. The challenges we face today, climate change, political polarization, economic inequality, technological disruption, TNC, don't have predetermined solutions. How we respond to these challenges depends on choices being made by real people in real time. Understanding this is both terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because it means we can't assume that things will work out okay automatically. Empowering because it means we actually have the power to influence how things work out. But perhaps the most profound lesson of Napoleon's alternative timeline is what it teaches us about the nature of progress itself. We tend to think about history as a story of inevitable progress, MA, from primitive to advanced, from authoritarian to democratic, from poor to prosperous. We assume that the developments that created our modern world represent improvements over what came before. But Napoleon's alternative timeline challenges this assumption. In many ways, his hypothetical continental empire would have been more advanced than what actually developed during the 19th century. Earlier, technological development, more efficient economic integration, less devastating warfare, more effective international cooperation. This doesn't mean Napoleon's system would have been better in every way. Questions about individual freedom and democratic participation remain important. But it does mean that historical development doesn't follow a single path toward predetermined improvements. There are multiple possible trajectories for human civilization, and the one we followed wasn't necessarily the best one available. This has enormous implications for how we think about future development. Instead of assuming that current trends will automatically lead to better outcomes, we need to actively choose which trajectory we want to follow. Do we want technological development to continue along current paths, or should we redirect it toward different priorities? Do we want economic systems to evolve according to existing patterns, or should we create different structures? Do we want political arrangements to develop incrementally from current institutions, or should we design fundamentally different approaches? These aren't questions that will be answered automatically by historical forces. They're questions that will be answered by individual decisions made by people like us. And this brings us to the final, most important lesson of Napoleon's alternative timeline: the incredible power and responsibility of historical consciousness. Most people live their lives without thinking much about historical contingency. They accept the world as it is, assume it developed inevitably, and don't consider their role in shaping what comes next. But once you understand how Napoleon's different choices could have created a completely different world, you can't go back to thinking about history as inevitable. You start to see the contingency everywhere. You realize that every institution, every system, every pattern of development exists because of specific choices made by specific people who could have chosen differently. And this changes how you think about your own choices. Every time you vote, you're participating in the process that determines political development. Every time you make an economic decision, you're influencing the evolution of economic systems. Every time you choose what to learn or teach or create, you're contributing to cultural and intellectual development. These aren't just personal choices with personal consequences. They're historical choices that contribute to the trajectory of human civilization. Napoleon couldn't have predicted that his invasion of Russia would shape European development for the next 2 centuries. But his decision to cross the Niemen River turned out to be one of the most consequential individual choices in human history. We can't predict which of our choices will turn out to have similar historical significance, but Napoleon's alternative timeline teaches us that any of our choices might matter enormously, which means we need to approach all of them with the care and consideration they potentially deserve. The world we live in is the result of countless individual decisions made by people who mostly had no idea they were shaping history. The world our descendants will live in will be the result of decisions we're making right now, mostly without realizing their potential historical significance. Understanding this is both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it means we bear real responsibility for the future of human civilization. Inspiring because it means we have real power to influence that future in positive directions. Napoleon's alternative timeline isn't just an entertaining thought experiment about the past. It's a window into understanding how historical change actually works, and what that means for our role in creating the future. The next time you face a decision, whether it seems important or routine, remember that you're not just choosing what happens to you personally. You're participating in the same process of historical change that created our entire world, and that will create whatever world comes next. That's both the burden and the gift of historical consciousness. Understanding that the future isn't predetermined, that individual choices matter enormously, and that we all bear responsibility for shepherding human civilization toward the best possible outcomes. The story of Napoleon's alternative Russian victory is really the story of how individual human choices create the trajectory of human civilization itself, and that story is still being written by every decision we make today.